All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Hoot. Today we'll be talking about debugging Istio. We do these Hoot shows, live streams around every 2 weeks. Now it's some conferences, so a little bit less. We try to keep this interactive. I'll be talking, and feel free, I'll be watching the chat. And feel free to talk and kind of ask questions throughout. You can also say hi, introduce yourself, and we try to keep it technical. So doing these deep dives. Today we're going to be talking about debugging Istio. And by the way, if everybody can hear or see me okay, just let me know in the chat so I know that the audio is coming out okay. And let's get right to it. So I prepared some slides, and as always, there will be some demos. And let's start with the slides. So first thing, in order to debug something, you gotta kind of understand it, right? So to find the cause of a problem in Istio or any other system for that matter, we need to kind of understand the system. So the first thing we're gonna do is gonna overview kind of the general high level of how Istio and Envoy operate in this context. And then we're gonna go over a few tips and tricks. I have a Istio setup on kind. You can probably hear the laptop fan roaring from all the containers running on it. And we're gonna do some live demonstrations of how this all works. All right, I see you can hear me, so thank you for that. And let's continue. So let's first talk about how the control plane operates. What's the configuration flow, right? So in Kubernetes, you have various CRDs, right? You have a virtual service, you have destination rule, you have a bunch more authorization policies. Istio, formerly known as Pilot, watches all these CRDs and have, the internal state of these CRDs in memory. And it translates that to an XDS snapshot that Envoy understands, right? And Envoy connects to Pilot using XDS and gets these configuration updates, right? So you got to remember that Envoy is not Kubernetes aware and is not Istio aware. Envoy has its own configuration language, and we've covered it in the past episodes, so you can watch those videos to kind of get a refresher on that. Envoy talks in the language of clusters and listeners, right? And in Kubernetes, you talk in services, virtual services, destination rules. So the main job of Istio is take this user level configuration, watch it, make sure it's always in sync, translate it to an XDS configuration that Envoy understands, and stream it to Envoy using the XDS, right? And the reason I'm saying this because once you understand the process, you understand where errors can happen. So for example, in the translation, it could be that you have a problem in the translation, right? It could be that you're generating config that looks valid to you on the CRD level, but when you aggregate it together to an XDS snapshot, it becomes invalid, right? So that's an example. So it's important to understand how these things work in order to understand where the problems can be. Now, the other path of data flow is the data plane, right? So information in Istio, as we all probably know, each pod has a sidecar proxy, Istio proxy. You can see it in Istio, and it's an Envoy inside it. The application talks to the proxy, and the proxy talks to another proxy that talks to an application. And that's how kind of the secret sauce of the service mesh is sidecar proxy, right? And if you have a problem for your request to get from one place to the other, it might be useful to look at those proxies and see what they're doing, kind of debug the data flow. So again, it depends on what problem you have. You'll take different approaches, but it's good to keep in mind those points where the service mesh interacts with the user and interacts with data, so you know where problems can be. All right. So generally stuff I've seen in Istio that I need to debug, it's I've seen in these categories. So invalid control plane configuration, right? You create configuration objects in Istio. They can interact with each other, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly. And you can actually create a configuration that each object on its own is valid, but together as a snapshot, it's not valid. So that's an example. You can have invalid configuration on the data plane. So that's very easy to achieve with an Envoy filter, right? You create an Envoy filter and give a bad filter configuration. Envoy will reject this configuration as invalid, right? And the key here that the control plane has no way of knowing ahead of time that this configuration is invalid because only Envoy knows that. And the other thing I've seen is that you have unexpected interactions, right? So a lot of people are surprised to see that in Envoy, routes are not automatically sorted, right? So if you have a route, they're essentially processed linearly one by one. So if you have a route that catches a prefix slash and a route that catches prefix slash foo, then that second route will never hit because Envoy will always go to the first route, right? If you have a more generic route matcher that is first on the route list, it will always catch. So Envoy just matches the routes as they appear on the list, right? So that's kind of something that can be unexpected to people, that they don't understand the behavior, therefore they apply a configuration and things don't work the way they think. All right, one more thing I want to say. When we debug the control plane logic, kind of like that first slide I showed, you can pay attention to Istio dlogs. Envoy can send knacks on bad configuration. They also appear in the Istio dlogs. Envoy has a stat. We'll review that when we get to the live stuff that says what updates from the control plane Envoy has rejected. And I'll get to that. I'll show that stat. It'll be 0 in our case, but you'll see what exactly where it is. And when we're talking about the data flow, you can look at Envoy config dumps. Essentially, you want to see all the Istio configuration the way it's aggregated. Then you want to be able to essentially kind of see the configuration as it is in the proxy, right? You don't want to see a configuration that's kind of let me rephrase this. So if you remember the first diagram, you have Istio aggregating virtual services and producing Envoy configs. The Envoy config dump gives you essentially the result of that. So you can see exactly what is the proxy doing and not what you think it might do based on the CRDs. And right, and if you want to see the requests flowing through Envoy, you can look at debug logs, and we will show an example of that. And another thing you can show an example of is because all of this can get complicated, Envoy has the ability to add to the access logs which route it's selected, and we'll show how that works in a sec. In addition, IstioCTL, now I really gotta hand it to the Istio team. They added a lot of powerful debugging capabilities into IstioCTL itself. Things that I used to manually have to go to the Envoy admin page to pilot and figure out discrepancies. Now it's a lot easier with IstioCTL. There's a lot of debug tool built in directly into IstioCTL. Now, any questions for everything I just said up until now? And looking at the chat, so far it's quiet. All right, so let's switch over to the desktop view. One sec. Here we go, desktop. I'll take, all right. So I have here a setup with Istio. I installed it locally. Let me make this bigger. Make this smaller. And you can see that I have all the book info pods, and you can see that this 2 out of 2 is important because usually book info has 1 container, but when it's injected, it has 2 containers. So we have 2 out of 2 containers ready, which is great. Now, if you have something going wrong with Istio, like I said, the first thing I would usually do is you can use the Istio analyze command. So Istio really added a bunch of great diagnostic to the Istio command. So when you do Istio analyze, you can see that I have here bad configuration, right? I am referencing a subset that is not defined in the destination rule, right? And I did that on purpose, obviously. So you can see that if I get a virtual service, and let me know if you're not seeing the text of the terminal big enough. I also heard that sometimes can be an issue. If you see this virtual service, I refer to a subset, but there's no destination rule that contains this subset, right? So in Istio, whenever you create a destination, whenever your destination is a subset, you have to define a destination rule that defines what is that subset, right? And internally in Istio, this translates to another cluster configuration. So basically to fix this, all I need to do is apply the destination rules. And now I have destination rules, wonderful. So let's just take a quick look at one of them. And you can see that this destination rules define the subsets, right? So I have your name v1, and this is the name of the subset that I just referred from the virtual service. But because I didn't have the destination rule, it didn't exist, and Istio didn't know what to do, right? And you see the subset is defined to be the labels of version 1. And this is pretty much the vanilla Istio example destination rules. I just wanted to demonstrate what happens when you apply them out of order. So now when we do Istio analyze, everything looks good. All right, and again, if there's any question, I'm looking at the chat, feel free to monitor them. Another thing that is nice with a recent version of Istio, they added kind of like how Envoy has an admin page, they added something similar to Pilot. So let's go and do that. You can also access it with Istio dashboard. You can do Istio dashboard Control-Z deployment Istio system, or you can also access it if you don't have Istio access it directly with kubectl port forward, and then just open the browser. So if we go to localhost 9876, you can see the Istio Control-Z interface, and you can change log levels, you can look at various metrics. If you're trying to understand what's going on, for example, with resource translation, that might be a good place to start by incrementing the Istio log level and seeing what might be the cause. All right, and let's see if there's any questions. So far, so good. All right, let's move on. 1 sec. Let's kill this kubectl. We don't need it anymore. And let's open kubectl to the Envoy admin page. So every Envoy is configured to have the Envoy admin page, and we covered it in past episode. I'll do a short recap now. Envoy has an admin page that allows you to gather debug information on Envoy itself, right? So it's in every Istio injected pod, it's available in port 15,000. So now this will essentially forward traffic to port 15,000, and then if we go there, surprised it's not in my history from all the times I'm using it, you will get to the Envoy admin page, and here you can get good information that's related to what's going on with Envoy, right? So if we look at the config dump, for example, and this is the raw config dump, Istio is also a utility for that, which I'll show in a second. You can see that it's very, very long. The way Istio works, essentially there's a virtual listener that captures all the traffic using IP tables, and then it gets distributed to these virtual listeners, right? So you can see them. And I want to go to listeners. It's a bit slow. Okay. Dynamic listeners, and you can see that there's a bunch of matches here that essentially expose this virtual listener for every upstream service that this pod might access. So you can see this will match the virtual IP of a service, right? And then when a request goes out from Envoy, it will go through this listener with its set of filters, right? So this is a way for you to know what's happening with the request as far as configuration. If there's any configuration for incoming or outgoing requests, you can see the effect of it here. Bump the, yes, let's bump the, thank you, Shane. Now this is a lot of data. Let's look at what Istio also has to offer here. So Istio has compacted the Istio, allow you to get a kind of a short version of this config dump. So you can, here we go, you can do a few things. So for example, you can do Istio proxy config clusters to get the Envoy clusters over certain deployment or pod, right? Same for listeners and routes. So I'll show listeners next, right? Istio proxy config listeners, and you can see, one sec, here we go. You can see the virtual listener in port 15006 that transparently proxies the pod, right? So everything kind of goes through here before it makes it to the pod, and that listener captures the raw traffic. All right. And of course, there's also a proxy config routes. One sec, here we go. And it's a similar idea, right? Now, Istio proxy config essentially helps you parse this config dump because it's pretty huge. So if you have Istio near you, you can use proxy config to make it easier to understand. And if not, you can just go to the admin page and see the config dump. I figure I show both ways so everybody can do whatever works for them. Why doesn't the Istio proxy config route show TCP route? Because I'm not sure what you mean by TCP route. The problem with TCP is that there's no request concept, right? So there's no really routes to talk about. In Envoy, RDS only applies in the context of HTTP because when here, for example, you match the request that start with / there's no matching of a request in TCP, right? There's no request, it's just streams of bytes. I hope that answers the question. For routes to happen, you need a notion of a protocol, an application level protocol with requests and responses, and TCP is just a stream of bytes. Now, another thing that you might want to understand, Envoy has something called Bootstrap configuration that defines the initial, how to connect to the control plane and all that stuff. Some metadata that Envoy sends to the control plane. If you want to look at that, Istio can also help you. There's proxy config Bootstrap. It will spew out the Bootstrap config. And in addition, if you want to do that, and I'll show the alternative without Istio, like into the Istio proxy pod and cat the Bootstrap config that's essentially in this location, right? So this will return the same thing. All right, so far so good. Any questions? All right, another important thing to keep in mind with Envoy and Istio, you want to make sure that, if you remember the first slide, you have a translation loop that takes the CIDs, convert them to an XDS snapshot, and Envoy watches that snapshot and syncs on it, right? So you want to make sure that Envoy is in sync with what Pylo gives it, right? You want to make sure that nothing interferes with that. And now that can happen for few reasons. Could be loss of connectivity. It could be that there is a configuration error and Envoy refuses to accept the snapshot, what's called a NAC. And we're going to show how to detect that situation. Oh, we have one more question in that chat. One thing, you get an error and it's trying to test TLS ingress gateway with self-signed certificates. Any requirement for that? Envoy doesn't really care that much about certificates. It really depends how Istio configures it. If you define Envoy with a verification context, it will try to verify the cert. Now, certificates, basically there can be a few places where this can go wrong, right? If we're talking about certificates, when a request comes into an ingress, you gotta make sure that the verification, if the verification context is set, you need to make sure that everything is signed properly. I assume you mean that you're doing MTLS. The other thing is some certificates are kind of touchy with the fields that are in them. You got to make sure that the key usage is set correctly. You can do key encipherment. I think if it's a certificate authority, it has to have a CA flag in it. So it could be that the certificate itself has an issue. So in order to debug something like that, I would take your certificate and I would take just simple vanilla Envoy, static Envoy configuration. And first make sure that Envoy is okay with that certificate on its own, without unrelated to Istio. And then if everything works there, we can take it to, it's probably some problem with the Istio Envoy. And then we can look at, the config dump, how it was applied. I hope that kind of gives you a hint how to debug this kind of problem. So yes. All right. So moving on, and if you need any more clarifications, feel free to write in the chat. Moving on. Let's see how we can see that Envoy is in sync with the listeners, right? So listeners is how Envoy listens to traffic, and clusters is how Envoy sends it upstream. Endpoints, this is essentially the endpoints in a cluster. And routes, these are routes in the HTTP connection manager, right? So as long as all these four are synced, you're good. So what if, for example, one of them is not synced? It kind of gives you a hint of where the problem is. So for example, if LDS is not synced, it might be there's a NAC because of filter configurations, because filters are on the listener, right? So you can now look, maybe an Envoy filter go wrong, something like that, right? Same, if CDS is not sync, there might be a cluster that Envoy rejects for some reason, right? So depending on which one of these are not synced, it gives you a hint of where the problem might be, right? So another thing you can do with a proxy status that's actually very nice as far as Istio, you can do a proxy status on a specific pod or deployment. In our case, it says that everything matches, and if it didn't match, the nice thing with IstioCTL, it will actually show you a diff between the configuration provided by pilot, by IstioD, and the configuration currently in Envoy. So it's a really powerful tool, and it can help you pinpoint on what object is triggering the problem. We have another question from the chat. How does Istio use a Kubernetes service to create an Envoy cluster? Yes, that's a great question. So in fact, instead of talking, let me show you KGS. So these are all the services that are in Kubernetes right now. Now, the main difference between a Kubernetes service, well, I wouldn't say the main difference, but one of the more important differences between a Kubernetes service and an Envoy cluster, the Kubernetes service can have more than one port, But an Envoy cluster, it's a single, destination. You tell Envoy route to this cluster. You don't tell it route to this cluster and this port, right? So, and you'll see that why is this important in a second, and how this translates, right? So, an Kubernetes cluster is pretty straightforward. Now, in addition to the service, and let me just focus on one of these services so it's easier to demo. There's the endpoints, right? So you can see the cluster IP here for the service, but if instead of KGS's Kubernetes get services, if instead you do Kubernetes get endpoints, you can see the endpoints object of the service, right? And one sec, I want to make sure everything's good here. Yes, perfect. Sorry, I got a weird message about network. It looks good. You can see the endpoints for the service, right? And these are all essentially the member pods in the service, right? So it's very similar to what we talked about clusters and endpoints in Envoy. The difference is a service can have more than one port, and a cluster in Envoy can actually have more interesting things happening to it. It can have health checks, it can have outlier detection, passive health checks. So the way this works is that the basis is that services are translated to clusters and endpoints are translated to EDS endpoints, right? It's called a cluster load assignment in the Envoy language. And we can see this right here. So for example, if we go to clusters, why did I misspell? Cluster. Okay, here we go. And of course, there's infinity of them. Why can't I find? I'll just look for. I'll just look for a product page directly. Probably be easier. Here we go. So we have here a cluster, and you can see how Istio converted the product page service into an Envoy cluster, right? So because there's multiple ports, the port is added to the cluster name, right? So we have here the Kubernetes. So this is the cluster name, right? And Envoy doesn't really care what it is as long as it's unique. You have here the cluster, the original Kubernetes service name. Since we have destination rules, you have here the subset name from the destination rule, right? So if you have a destination rule, it can actually create each subset in a destination rule is represented as a different Envoy cluster, right? And you have here the port, and you have your outbound to differentiate from inbound. Inbound is going to be the current app, and outbound will be pretty much everything else, right? So this means that this is going outside the pod to a different pod, right? So if you define more subsets in the destination rule, for each subset, you're going to have a cluster representing the subset. And if you define, for example, outlier detection in a destination rule, they also will end up in the cluster, right? So an Envoy cluster is kind of a combination of a Kubernetes service and a destination rule, right? And there are more ways to create Envoy clusters from Istio, for example, with a service entry, but let's ignore that for now. Now, as far as endpoints, you can see them in the clusters endpoint here. So if you are seeing, for example, that you're routing to a specific subset, but it's not going where you think it's going, you can see here what endpoints make this subset. All right, so I hope that answers this question. All right, so let's see, where were we? Moving on, we were talking about syncing. We were talking about Istio CTL, and we were talking about how you can see the status of a pod, of a specific pod, in relation to what the control plane gives it. Now, the one more thing I want to say here is that if you look at the Envoy stats, you can see, and I really recommend you monitor this with your monitoring Prometheus tag driver, whatever it may be. And here we go. You can see this stat. This stat is very important, the update rejected stat. So you can see there's one for CDS and one for LDS. And this means what updates Envoy received from the control plane that it actively rejected, that it had an issue with on the configuration level and rejected them, right? So if you see this gets incremented too much, you know that you have something wrong. And, I highly recommend, setting an alert on that stat to make sure everything's in order. All right, so this is about how to make sure that Envoy syncs correctly to the control plane. Any more questions in that regard? I think I'm about to wrap up. Oh, one more thing I wanted to show is debug logs, but before I go there, let me know if there's any question. Was the explanation on how the Istio and Kubernetes services translate to Envoy clusters, was that clear or any clarification needed? Please let me know. And if you like it, obviously hit like. All right. Chat so far looks quiet. That's good. I guess it means I did a good job here. So let's move on. One more thing I wanted to show is access logs. So when I installed Istio, let me show you how I installed it. Oops, what is this? I install it with mesh config access log file equals std out. And that means that Envoy access logs goes into std out. Now, why is that important? When I apply the virtual service, I added to the details, I added a name to the route. Now, if you remember, I told you routes are processed in order. And if you're not sure if your route is hitting or not, this is a technique to find out. So you give a name to the route. You set up the access logs, and then let's generate some traffic, obviously. This is the book info. And now let's look at the logs. Let's see what's happening. So let's look at the logs of a pod that accesses the details. And this is the product page pod, right? So if we look at the Istio proxy container inside the product page, what we will see, and let me just do a quick search. Here we go. You can see a log line for details, and the last element of the line is the route name. And you can see that my details default route indeed hit, right? So this name exactly the route name I gave it in the virtual service. So that's kind of a way to know and debug if and when your routes are hitting. Let's see, we have a question that says, so kube proxy is not used. That's correct. Not only that's correct, that's a common problem, right? So Envoy writes directly to the pods, no kube proxy. And that is important to understand, because that means that Kubernetes readiness probes are not in effect, right? So you kind of have to use Envoy mechanisms for that. For example, you want to probably define health checks and outlier detection. I think if you run Istio in endpoint size mode, this also might help, but no guarantees there. I might not know what I'm talking about here. But yes, that's true. We're not going through kube proxy. The reason we're not going through kube proxy is that kube proxy is a TCP level proxy, right? And if you want all those HTTP level retries, features, metrics, access log, you can't use kube proxy, right? You have to understand stuff on the HTTP level, right? So if you want to do load balancing on a per request basis, that's not something that kube proxy lets you do, right? When you connect to kube proxy, you connect through a virtual IP of the service, and it connects you to a single pod throughout the connection's lifetime. So if an endpoint does not pass health check, shouldn't remove Yes, it should. It really depends how the control plane handles it, right? Because if an endpoint is instantly removed, it might have consequences on, basically because everything is eventually consistent, you can't guarantee that if an endpoint is removed from the control plane that the data plane will observe it immediately. I hope that answers the question. Yes, the answer is yes. Envoy will detect it through the control plane that an endpoint was removed, but it's not through kubeproxy. So if you're relying on kubeproxy functionality, you know what I mean? If you have a readiness probe that that temporarily makes it not alive in kubeproxy, you have to make sure that this information propagates to Envoy. Now, it should work with Istio. If you implement your own control plane, it's also a problem you need to solve. But yeah, no, kubeproxy is not involved in here. All right. And one more thing I wanted to do before we wrap, and I hope that answered your question. I know it's a bit all over the place here, so let me know if that's a good answer if you have a follow-up. While I prep, the last demo for the day is showing some Envoy debug logs. I guess the conclusions of this is you gotta test everything. All right, so first thing we do is we turn on debug logs by using the Envoy admin page, right? We go to logging and do level debug. And of course I forgot X post. Here we go. You gotta make a post request to mutating request on the Envoy admin page. Now we can look. This time let's look at details. Why is this turning? What? Okay, here we go. Sorry, my computer shortcuts. Let's take a look at details. -F. Wait one sec. Sorry, I was on reviews. All right. So let's look at reviews. Okay, here we go. Now you can see the debug log, debug level log. Now if I refresh. Oh, I killed the port forward, obviously. Let me just bring that back. All right, here we go. Now, if I refresh, get product page making a request, you can see the requests flowing through Envoy. So you can see that product page made a request to reviews. You can see the method. Envoy prints out the whole request, and you can see that it came from product page. Right, so if you have a really low-level issue to debug, you don't understand why is the request misbehaving, maybe authorization policy, you can turn on Envoy debug logs to see the exact request, headers, everything that Envoy receives. All right, so that concludes the demos I've been wanting to show. I see for Istio we don't need other aspects besides of a readiness and liveness. You gotta, unrelated to everything we just said, you gotta be careful with a liveness probe, because when a liveness probe fails, I believe the pod gets terminated. As far as health checks, in theory, yes. In practice, there is this eventual consistency, right? Even if you have readiness probes. So the problem is that even if you have readiness probe in Kubernetes, you don't know when the information will propagate to Envoy, right? And you can have a bunch of failure scenarios. Let's say Istio crashes all of a sudden, and the pod starts to go down. Let's say you have a readiness probe that does a health check on the pod's health check, right? It might not propagate to Envoy in time. Right, and in that sense, because Envoy is not aware of the Kubernetes readiness probes, you might want to add a second layer of protection by enabling something like outlier detection. I hope that makes sense. You basically, in this distributed world, you have this eventual consistency that there's nothing really you can do to prevent it in the end of the day, right? And when I mean to say Envoy is not aware of a Kubernetes readiness probe, usually you use the readiness probe to check, you check the pod's health, you see that it's ready to serve traffic, you flip the switch, right? Now, all good and well, let's say the pod's about to start going down, the readiness probe starts to fail. There is no guarantee that this information will propagate to Envoy on time, right? So you kind of want to enable Envoy to also understand it on its own if the control plane is not fast enough, or maybe down for some reason, maybe you're doing an upgrade and it's resetting. Maybe someone messed up the policy, the network policy, and there's no connection, right? A lot of things can go wrong. And that's what I meant when I say the readiness probe Envoy is not aware of it, right? So on a healthy scenario, it's all going to work fine. The readiness probe will take the endpoint from the endpoints object, and Istio will propagate it to Envoy. But there could be failure scenarios. I hope that makes more sense now that I have a bit of time to gather my thoughts. If there's a way to do outlier detection based on a custom response header, I'm honestly not sure. I'll have to check the Envoy docs. You know what? Why not? Let's do it together. So let me bring up the desktop again. We'll go to Envoy proxy. Bam! I'm autopilot clicking the Envoy docs already. Docs, latest, because why not? API, v3 reference, and here you go to cluster configuration. You go to outlier detection. Bam, outlier detection, interval, enforcing. I don't see a header match here, so I don't think so. Yeah, consecutive 500s. Let's see if there's a header match. No, I don't think there is a custom header. You can decide if it's I think what they do allow you to decide is if it's what I'm seeing here, the gateway failure is essentially the distinction if the failure is from the upstream or from Envoy, I think. I'll have to look a bit more deep to tell you, but I don't see a way to change the header value that's considered a failure for outlier detection. But if you're not talking, all right, that's actually a good point. I'm not sure if you can configure active health checks in Istio. There is a way to tell Envoy to fail health check immediately, right? So you can have, if you're using the health check, active health checks in Envoy, you can set a header x Envoy fail, something like this. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, of course I can find it. Let's just look for fail. There is a header you can set in the response to let Envoy know to fail health check immediately and not to wait for the health check to fail, gradually. I think this should enable the header. Blah blah blah. Here we go. So if you're using Envoy health check and Envoy sees this header, and there's a configuration to also set it on every response, not just on a health checker response. But normally if this is returned, then Envoy immediately fails health check. But I don't know if this is exposed in Istio or not, but Envoy does have the ability. Reason I'm asking is you're using GraphQL, and GraphQL always returns to 100. Yes. Yes, so this is exactly for your use case. So another thing you can do is set up a different endpoint for health checks, right? And fail that endpoint instead of failing the main endpoint. But if you want to fail, if you wanted a header to signal that you should kind of drain requests to the host, then I think this is what you're looking for, but I'm not sure if it's supported in Istio. Yes, I hope that answers the question. All right, unless there's any more questions, I think we'll wrap up for the day. I think next Hoot Scott will be doing, you can sign up obviously for our channel for updates, come to our Slack, talk with us. We try to engage the community. If there's more questions, you can feel free to leave comments on the video. I'll try and monitor comments in the last few days, watch them and answer. The examples I'll upload to the GitHub Hoot. Go to the GitHub solo.io/Hoot. You can find show notes and code examples for to review later. Also, the slides will be there, so feel free to check out the repo. And again, show us you like what we're doing. Hit like, hit subscribe, start the repo, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you all for joining.